Elon Musk's son tells Trump something about his black friend that leaves him stunned. At a private gathering, an unexpected exchange between Donald Trump and Elon Musk's son took a shocking turn. Musk's son casually mentioned something about his black friend that left Trump momentarily speechless. Witnesses say his reaction was priceless, caught off guard in a way few have seen before. What was said that left the former president so stunned? The answer might surprise you. It was a sunny afternoon, and the room was alive with conversation, laughter, and the rustle of papers as guests moved about, mingling in the large hall. The event was supposed to be a casual gathering, a meeting of influential figures from all walks of life, entrepreneurs, politicians, and intellectuals. Among them was a young boy, no more than 10, sitting quietly at a corner table, watching the room with a keen, observant gaze. His presence was unassuming, but something about the way he watched the world around him seemed different, almost as if he were aware of something others weren't. Across the room, former President Donald Trump stood in animated conversation with a group of businessmen, his hands moving with grand gestures as he shared his thoughts on the future of American industry. But it was the boy's next move that would send ripples through the conversation. He hadn't said much all evening, but when he did speak, it was with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. The boy stood up suddenly, drawing attention to himself as he made his way through the crowd. His steps were slow but purposeful, his eyes focused on something ahead. He reached the small group near Trump, where the conversation had shifted to something much more personal than politics. Trump, still lost in his thoughts, looked down at the boy and smiled. Well, what's this? Someone's got something to say," Trump asked, his voice dripping with the familiar confidence that had characterized his years in the public eye. The boy didn't smile back. He simply nodded, his eyes never leaving Trump's. "I've been listening to all the stories, the promises of greatness, and how you plan to make everything better again," the boy said, his voice calm but firm. "But there's something you don't understand. Something I think you should know." The words were simple, yet there was an undeniable weight to them. Trump's smile faltered for just a moment, as if unsure of what was coming next. The businessmen standing around the two exchanged looks, sensing the tension in the air. "Go on," Trump said, intrigued. The room fell silent, all ears now on the boy. "My friend," the boy continued, "he's different from me. He doesn't look like me, and sometimes the world isn't as kind to him as it is to me. But you know what? He's smarter, braver, and stronger than anyone I know." Trump's eyebrows arched, clearly unsure of where this was going. He shifted his weight slightly, watching the boy with growing curiosity. "My friend has something you don't," the boy said, now looking directly into Trump's eyes. "He has the ability to make people see him for who he is, not what they want him to be. He doesn't have the luxury of being ignored when people are afraid of what they don't understand." Trump opened his mouth to speak, but the boy held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not done," the boy said, his tone more forceful now. "You see, my friend, he's black. And for some reason, people like you, people who think they know everything, don't even stop to see how that affects him. He's treated differently. He's judged by the color of his skin, not the content of his character." Trump's expression hardened, his face flickering with a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. The businessmen around him seemed to shrink back, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "I don't know if you've ever been on the receiving end of that kind of hate, but I have," the boy continued. "And so has my friend. He's told me stories of how he walks into a store, and people look at him like he's a criminal. He's had doors slammed in his face, his ideas dismissed, his talents ignored, all because of something he can't control." Trump's lips tightened. He had heard similar complaints before, but this time, the words came from a source he hadn't expected, a child, and one with a clarity and understanding that was unsettling. "He's not asking for sympathy," the boy said, his voice lowering now to a whisper. "He's not asking for charity. He just wants people to look at him for who he really is. A person with dreams, with potential. Someone who matters." For a moment, the room was silent. The businessmen who had been watching the interaction stood still, uncertain of what to make of the boy's words. Even Trump seemed to be taken aback, as though the reality of the situation had struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Do you know how many times he's been overlooked, underestimated?" the boy asked. "How many doors have been closed to him just because of his skin color? Do you even care?" Trump stood motionless, his face unreadable. The words stung, not because he didn't understand them, but because he hadn't truly understood them before. The boy took a step closer to Trump, his small frame looking almost fragile next to the towering figure of the former president. But there was a certain strength in the boy's presence, a quiet power that seemed to fill the space between them. "I don't want you to feel sorry for him," the boy said softly. "I want you to understand. I want you to see him for who he is, just like anyone else. Not because you have to, but because you should." Trump's gaze flickered toward the ground, his mind clearly racing. He had always prided himself on his ability to be tough, to handle the weight of criticism without flinching. But this was different. This wasn't a politician or a business deal he could manage with his usual tactics. This was something deeper, something he hadn't prepared for. "Your friend, he's a strong person," Trump finally said, his voice slow, as if searching for the right words. "But the world's a complicated place. You know that, don't you?" The boy nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression, no relief from his words. He wasn't done yet. "You're right," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "It's complicated, but it shouldn't be. People shouldn't be treated differently because of the color of their skin. They shouldn't have to fight harder for the same things that others take for granted. That's not how it should be." Trump stared at him for a long moment. The boy's words hung in the air, and for the first time that evening, the former president found himself at a loss for words. The usual confidence he exuded seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a quiet realization of something he hadn't fully considered before. The room remained still. No one dared to speak, as if everyone was waiting for Trump's next move. Finally, Trump cleared his throat and looked down at the boy. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice softer now. "Maybe there's more I need to understand." The boy didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Trump, his eyes searching, as if trying to gauge the sincerity behind the words. After a long pause, he nodded once and turned away, his small figure moving through the crowd once again. Trump stood there for a moment longer, his mind swirling with the weight of the conversation. He had been confronted by something unexpected, something he wasn't sure how to process. The young boy had said something that no one else had dared to voice so clearly, so directly, and for the first time in a long while, Trump wasn't sure where he stood. The conversations around the room slowly picked up again, but the mood had shifted. There was an unease now, a subtle change in the way people looked at each other. It wasn't the kind of unease that came from a political debate or a controversial statement. It was the kind of unease that came from a realization that perhaps things weren't as simple as they seemed, that maybe the world needed to change in ways that even the most powerful among them hadn't considered. And as the boy disappeared into the crowd, his words still echoed in the minds of those who had witnessed the exchange. It was a moment that none of them would forget. But what would happen next? Would the boy's words resonate with Trump? Would they make a difference? That was a story that was far from over. As the boy walked away, his small steps fading into the crowd, the room began to hum again with conversation, but the weight of the moment lingered. The businessmen who had been watching from the sidelines found themselves glancing at each other with uncertain expressions, as though they were unsure whether to continue with their previous topics or acknowledge the uncomfortable shift that had just taken place. It wasn't every day that someone, especially a child, could command the attention of such a powerful crowd and shake their beliefs to the core. Trump stood still for a moment longer, his mind reeling with the words the boy had spoken. "He's smarter, braver, and stronger than anyone I know," the boy had said about his friend, and it echoed in Trump's mind like a whisper from the past, resonating with truths he hadn't allowed himself to fully confront. He had spent years listening to the concerns of others, brushing off criticism and pressure with the same confident demeanor he'd cultivated in his public life. But the boy's words had been different. They weren't a challenge to his policies or his approach to governance. They weren't even directed at him as a politician. They were something deeper, something personal, something that called into question his very understanding of the world. The former president shook his head, trying to clear the fog of thoughts that clouded his mind. It wasn't just the content of what the boy had said, it was the delivery, the unflinching honesty that came with those words. The boy wasn't looking for validation. He wasn't hoping for a response that would ease his discomfort. He was simply offering a perspective, a reality that Trump had never truly allowed himself to explore. Was it possible that, despite everything he had done, he had never fully grasped the reality of what people like the boy's friend went through? He had always prided himself on his ability to deal with tough situations, to handle criticism, and to be a master at navigating complex issues. But this felt different. For the first time, it seemed like there was no easy answer, no quick solution that would allow him to walk away without some sort of reckoning. The crowd around him slowly resumed its usual pace, but Trump remained still, as if caught in a moment of hesitation. He had been a man of action for as long as he could remember, a man who made decisions quickly and moved on without dwelling on second thoughts. But something about this moment made him want to pause, to reflect, to understand. He glanced around the room, observing the people laughing, talking, and drinking. Some were still in deep conversation, others lost in their own thoughts. But no one seemed to notice the subtle shift that had just occurred. No one seemed to grasp the significance of what had just been said. They were all too preoccupied with their own lives, their own priorities, their own worlds. Trump took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the bar. His hands rested on the cool marble countertop, and he looked at his reflection in the mirror across the room. He wasn't a man given to self-doubt, but in that moment, the reflection staring back at him felt somehow unfamiliar. The face was the same, sharp, confident, assertive. But the eyes? The eyes seemed different. They were less sure now, more cautious. Trump had spent so many years in the spotlight, facing down critics and challengers with a sense of invulnerability. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't about politics or power. This was about understanding people on a deeper level, seeing the world from their perspective, not his own. As he stood there, lost in thought, he felt a presence beside him. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The boy, who had somehow left a permanent imprint on the evening, had returned. The child wasn't alone this time. He was accompanied by his friend, the one he had spoken of so passionately just moments before. Trump's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the young boy's friend, a tall, slender figure, exuding an aura of quiet confidence. He had dark skin, the kind of deep, rich brown that people would stop and admire if they took the time to look. But Trump knew, even without speaking to him, that the world didn't always stop to admire him. The boy's friend looked at Trump, his gaze direct but not confrontational. There was something in his eyes, a mix of curiosity and wariness, that reminded Trump of the times he had faced tough negotiations, those moments when he was unsure whether he was about to make a deal or create an enemy. But this time, there was no business deal, no trade of promises or deals on the table. This was something personal, something raw. "Mr. Trump," the boy's friend said, his voice steady but cautious, "I wanted to introduce myself properly. My name is James." Trump nodded slowly, but he couldn't bring himself to speak just yet. There was something about James that struck him, something intangible that made him pause. The boy had been right. James was a person, a real living, breathing human being with dreams, hopes, and a story that didn't deserve to be ignored. "I've heard a lot about you," James continued, his voice laced with an unspoken understanding. "But I don't think you've really heard a lot about people like me." Trump blinked, the weight of the words hanging in the air. There was no malice in James' tone, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of the fact that people like him were often overlooked, people whose stories were rarely told in the way that mattered. "I've been thinking a lot about what your friend said," Trump finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "He's right, you know. I don't think I've ever truly understood what it's like to walk in your shoes." James looked at Trump for a moment, as though weighing his words. The young boy stood silently by his side, watching the interaction with an intensity that felt almost too mature for someone so young. "I appreciate you saying that," James replied. But understanding isn't enough. It's about action. It's about making sure that people like me aren't just given lip service when it's convenient or politically correct. It's about actually making the world a place where the color of our skin doesn't determine what doors we can open. Trump's throat tightened as he listened to James speak. The words weren't new to him. He had heard them many times before. But hearing them from James, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, made them feel more real, more urgent. There was a deep truth in those words, one that cut through the noise of political debates and social media outrage. It wasn't about checking off boxes on a list of things to fix. It was about real, tangible change. The room had quieted down again, as though the conversation between Trump and James had drawn the attention of the others. Some people looked on with curiosity, while others seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to engage with a moment that was becoming increasingly personal and profound. Trump's reputation, built on years of self-promotion and grand gestures, was now at odds with the gravity of the conversation he was having with this young man. James, Trump started, his voice faltering for the first time that evening. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've said things that I shouldn't have. I've been wrong about a lot of things. But I want to be better. I want to do better. James nodded, his expression softening. We all make mistakes, Mr. Trump. It's how we learn from them that matters. There was a brief silence as the weight of the conversation hung between them. Trump felt a shift within himself, a stirring that he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years focused on the future, on building his legacy, on claiming his place in history. But for the first time, he began to think about the legacy he was leaving behind for others, the legacy of those who came after him, those who wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I want to do better, Trump repeated, his voice firmer now. And I think I can. But I can't do it alone. I need people like you, people who understand this on a deeper level, to help guide me. James smiled faintly, as if he had expected this answer all along. We all need each other, Mr. Trump. No one can change the world on their own. But if we work together, we can make a real difference. Trump looked at him for a long time, the weight of his words sinking in. And in that moment, something shifted within him. He didn't know exactly what it meant or what would come of it, but he knew that this conversation, this interaction with James, was the beginning of something bigger than he had anticipated. It was the beginning of understanding. It was the beginning of change. As the evening wore on, the conversations resumed, but for Trump, the night was far from over. He had been handed an opportunity, a chance to reevaluate his approach, to challenge his own beliefs, and to make amends for the mistakes of the past. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. He wasn't walking it alone anymore. As the night stretched on, the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversations filled the air once again, but the feeling of transformation, however subtle, lingered. Trump stood in the center of it all, his thoughts swirling, trying to process the conversation that had unfolded just moments before. James, the boy's friend, had shaken him in a way that nothing in his years of business, politics, or even his personal life had. It was as though a veil had been lifted from his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he saw the world not just as it was presented to him, but through the lens of someone else's truth. He'd been a master at managing public perception, crafting an image of invulnerability, of strength and certainty. But now, as he stood there, surrounded by influential figures who were still caught up in the frenzy of their own worlds, he felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. He had spent so much of his life focusing on the narrative he wanted to project, but here, in this moment, the story was no longer his to control. It was something far larger, something far more complicated than the stories of success and power he had built his identity upon. As he moved toward a quiet corner of the room, seeking a moment of solitude to collect his thoughts, he found himself staring out of the large windows that lined one side of the building. The city skyline glowed under the dark sky, the lights reflecting off the glass in a mosaic of orange and yellow. It looked beautiful from a distance, a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. Yet, as Trump's gaze drifted across the sprawling landscape, he couldn't shake the sense that the view was incomplete. The towering skyscrapers, the luxury cars, the glimmering lights. It all seemed so polished, so carefully constructed. But was that all there was to life? Was that the truth of the world, or was there something deeper that he had been too blind to see? His phone buzzed in his pocket, a welcome distraction from the whirlwind of his thoughts. He pulled it out, half expecting a message from one of his advisors or someone in his inner circle. But it wasn't a business message. It was a text from his daughter, a simple message that read, "Are you coming home soon? I miss you." The words, so innocent, so personal, hit him harder than he anticipated. The reminder of his family, of the people who loved him, who saw him as more than just a figurehead, more than a symbol of success, reminded him that there was more to life than just the fight for recognition and control. It was easy to get lost in the noise of power, to get wrapped up in the complex world of politics and business. But moments like these, moments that reminded him of the love and care waiting for him at home, felt like a much-needed grounding force. He tapped out a quick reply, telling her that he would be home soon, then slipped the phone back into his pocket, trying to push the feeling of uncertainty away. But it lingered. He knew that what had transpired tonight wasn't something he could simply sweep under the rug. The boy's words and the quiet strength of his friend had dug deep into his conscience, and no amount of distractions or busy schedules could erase the discomfort they had sparked within him. Still, Trump wasn't a man who allowed himself to linger in discomfort for long. He had faced far too many challenges in his life to let a fleeting moment of introspection derail him. He needed to regain his focus, to remember why he was there, surrounded by the power brokers and the people who were supposed to shape the future. He wasn't in a position to question his entire existence, no matter how stirring the conversation had been. It was time to refocus. As if on cue, his chief of staff approached, pulling him from his thoughts. "Sir, the press is ready for you. They're all set for your statement," the man said, his tone brisk, professional. Trump nodded, swallowing the doubts that had begun to well up inside him. "Thank you," he replied, straightening his suit and stepping forward. The pressure to perform, to continue building the image he had so carefully crafted, was heavy. But it was familiar. It was a comfort zone, a space he knew how to navigate. With a deep breath, he pushed the conversation with James and the boy to the back of his mind. He would deal with it later. After all, there were still duties to perform, obligations to meet. The press room was as bustling as ever. Reporters and cameras were lined up, waiting for his entrance. There was a hum of expectation in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Trump walked to the podium, his usual confident stride returning, but this time there was something else in his demeanor, a quiet tension, a weight in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. It wasn't visible to the press, of course. He was still the picture of strength and authority, the man who commanded attention with every step he took. But within him, a shift had occurred, and he wasn't sure yet how to handle it. He cleared his throat as he took the microphone, scanning the room quickly before diving into his prepared statement. The words flowed smoothly, his rhetoric sharp and calculated. He spoke of progress, of new initiatives, of the great things he and his administration had accomplished. He was on autopilot, delivering the speech he had given countless times before. The crowd responded as expected, nodding and murmuring in approval, but somewhere in the back of his mind, the conversation with James gnawed at him. The boy's friend's words echoed once again. "It's not enough to understand. It's about action." As Trump spoke, a small voice at the back of his mind reminded him that he couldn't keep living in the same bubble he had built for himself. He couldn't just continue brushing off the real issues that others faced in favor of maintaining his image. He had done that for too long. He had been so focused on winning, on making deals, on climbing higher and higher, that he had lost sight of the human element, the stories of the people who weren't born into privilege, who didn't have the luxury of attending high-profile events or being seen as the picture of success. James' words had cracked open a part of him that had been sealed for years, a part that had been too busy to truly listen. The press conference eventually ended, but the questions, the commentary, and the speculation would continue long after he left the room. Trump, however, wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere now, consumed by the thought of the boy, of James, of the conversations that were yet to come. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on him. He couldn't ignore what had been said, and more importantly, he couldn't ignore the opportunity that lay before him. He left the press room and made his way to the private quarters. But he didn't go straight to his office. Instead, he found himself in a quiet, secluded space, his eyes drawn to the skyline once again. The city looked different now, almost as if it had been stripped of its veneer of perfection, revealing the messy, complex truth underneath. He wondered how many others had the chance to see the world the way he was beginning to see it. How many people were locked in their own worlds, their own stories, just waiting for someone to listen. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned around to see one of his advisors standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Sir, we've received word that James wants to meet with you privately," the advisor said, almost cautiously. Trump felt a small shock of surprise, but also a sense of anticipation. He had been expecting this moment to come, but now that it was upon him, he wasn't sure what he would say. James had reached out, and it wasn't just about discussing politics or making small talk. This meeting felt different, like a chance for real change. "Let him in," Trump said, his voice steady but unsure. This was a turning point, and as much as he had spent years positioning himself as the man who held all the answers, he knew that this meeting, this conversation, could change everything. Trump stood motionless, his hand still gripping the back of the chair, his mind racing with thoughts that refused to settle. He knew that James' request to meet with him privately was more than just a formality. This was the moment he had unknowingly been preparing for. The words that had been spoken to him earlier echoed in his mind, no longer just fragments of a conversation, but a weight that sat heavily on his chest. As he waited for James to enter, Trump reflected on the dynamic of their earlier interaction, the calm intensity of the young boy, his friend's quiet resolve, and how, in the span of a few minutes, everything he thought he knew about power and influence had been called into question. The door opened quietly, and James stepped inside, his presence commanding in a way that felt disproportionate to his age. Trump studied him for a moment, taking in the boy's calm demeanor. There was no nervousness in his eyes, no uncertainty. It was as though James had already anticipated this moment, had been preparing for it his entire life. The boy walked forward, his steps deliberate but not hurried. He wasn't coming to beg for anything or to make a plea. No, James was here to deliver a message, one that Trump didn't quite understand yet, but knew he would soon. James closed the door behind him with a soft click, and for a moment, the room was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, filtering through the windows. Trump took a step back, gesturing toward a chair opposite his own. "Please sit down," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tornado of emotions swirling inside him. James nodded and took the seat with the same calmness that had characterized his every movement so far. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. It was as though both were waiting for the other to make the first move, to reveal something, to break the silence that hung heavily between them. Finally, it was James who spoke first, his voice soft but filled with an unmistakable authority. "You know, when I was younger, I used to think that power was something you could touch," James began, his eyes never leaving Trump's. "I thought it was something physical, something tangible, like a crown or a scepter, something you could hold in your hand and show to the world." He paused, his lips curving into a faint, almost sad smile. "But the older I get, the more I realize it's not like that. Power doesn't look like what people expect. It doesn't have a form. It's not about buildings or money or influence. It's about the things people don't see, the quiet actions, the small moments of understanding, the real connections between people. Power is in the spaces where no one's looking." Trump felt a chill run down his spine, a strange mix of discomfort and intrigue. This wasn't a conversation he had been expecting, nor one he felt equipped to handle. He was used to commanding attention, to speaking in broad strokes about policies, achievements, and victories. But this was different. This was about something much deeper, something intangible. "I don't understand," Trump admitted, his voice low, almost apologetic, a side of him that rarely made an appearance. I've spent my whole life building an empire. I've been to the top of the world and back again. I've made deals, I've won battles, I've built fortunes. You're telling me none of that matters?" James looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing the question carefully, before responding. "What I'm telling you is that all of that matters, on the surface. But there's a whole other layer to the world that you haven't even begun to see. It's not about winning or losing. It's about understanding. It's about seeing people not as tools to be used, but as human beings with their own stories, their own struggles. What you've built, it's impressive. But what you've missed, that's where the real change happens." Trump's brow furrowed as he processed James' words. He had spent so much of his life focused on creating and maintaining power, on solidifying his place in history, that the idea of understanding felt almost foreign to him. He had always believed that to succeed, you had to control, you had to manipulate circumstances to your favor. The concept of seeing people as equals, of acknowledging their struggles, was something that felt like a distant ideal, one that had no practical application in the world he inhabited. James, sensing Trump's confusion, continued, his voice soft but firm. "You've spent your life building a world for yourself. But have you ever thought about the world you're leaving behind? It's easy to get wrapped up in your own success, but the true test is how your success affects others. If you can't see beyond your own reflection, you'll never understand the power that comes from real change." Trump's mind reeled. He had never thought about it in this way. Of course, he cared about people, his family, his friends, his supporters. He had always been driven by the desire to improve the country, to create jobs, to make America great. But what James was saying went beyond political promises and business ventures. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about the way his actions reverberated through the lives of others, how the choices he made affected people in ways he had never considered. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You want to make real change, Mr. Trump? Then you have to start seeing the world through the eyes of those who don't have the luxury of building their own empire. You have to listen, to truly listen." For the first time, Trump felt an overwhelming sense of guilt rise within him. He had spent years talking, making decisions, shaking hands, and signing deals. But had he truly listened? Had he ever taken the time to understand the stories of those whose lives were shaped by the very systems he had built? The answer was no. He had been too focused on the game, on winning the next battle, to notice the damage done along the way. I've never thought about it like that," Trump said slowly, his voice almost apologetic. "I've always been so focused on winning, on building, on making sure that I'm the one at the top. I didn't realize the price others were paying." James nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "That's the thing, Mr. Trump. It's not about guilt or shame. It's about understanding that there's always a price to pay for everything. And if you want to change the world, you have to be willing to pay that price, willing to see the cost in the people around you, the ones who don't have the voice to speak up." Trump swallowed hard. He felt as though the walls around him were crumbling, as though everything he had built his life upon was suddenly being questioned. It wasn't just the boy's words, it was the weight of his own realizations, the things he had avoided confronting for so long. The cost of his empire had never truly hit him until now. "I want to understand," Trump said finally, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. "But I don't know how. I don't know where to start." James gave him a knowing look, as though he had anticipated this moment. "The first step is simple," he said. "Start by listening. Start by opening your eyes to the people who are right in front of you, not as tools for your success, but as human beings. Understand their pain, their hopes, their dreams. And then, if you really want to make a difference, use your power not to control, but to uplift. Use your influence to give a voice to those who have none. That's how you create real change." Trump sat back in his chair, his mind racing with the weight of James' words. He had always been driven by the need to control, to build, to win. But in this moment, he realized that true power wasn't about dominance. It was about connection, understanding, and most importantly, using whatever platform you had to make the world a better place for everyone. The silence between them stretched on, but this time it was different. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty. It was a pause, a moment of reflection, before the beginning of something new. "I'll try," Trump said finally, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "I'll start by listening." And with that, the meeting ended, but the change that had begun in that quiet room would ripple out, slowly but surely, reshaping the way Trump saw the world and the way he used his power. As James stood to leave, Trump felt a glimmer of hope, an unexpected and unfamiliar sensation, growing within him. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. The silence in the room lingered long after James had left. Trump sat back in his chair, staring out the window, his thoughts a storm of emotions. What had just happened? How had a conversation with a child, barely more than a teenager, managed to unearth something so deep within him? It was almost as if James had seen through the carefully constructed layers of his persona, past the walls of bravado and arrogance, and exposed something raw, something he had buried for years. Trump wasn't sure if he was more bewildered or grateful. All his life, he had believed that success came from conquering the world, from standing on top and never showing weakness. But James' words had cracked that foundation, revealing a truth he hadn't even known he was looking for. It wasn't power that made the world move, it was understanding. It wasn't control that shaped destinies, it was connection. Trump had always thought he knew the game. He'd been playing it his entire life. He had built an empire, cultivated an image of success, and wielded influence like a weapon. But now, sitting alone in that room, he wasn't sure how much of it mattered anymore. Was it all just a facade? Was it all just about winning for the sake of winning? He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. The weight of responsibility suddenly felt heavier than ever. James had shown him something that Trump had never truly considered: the price of power. The cost wasn't in the money or the accolades. It was in the lives that were affected along the way, the people who were left behind or forgotten. And now, in this moment of introspection, Trump realized he had been blind to it. He had thought he was doing good, thought he was helping people by providing jobs, building a stronger economy, and pushing policies that benefited the country. But in his pursuit of greatness, had he been neglecting the people who needed help the most? Was it all just a game, played on the backs of those less fortunate? He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him, something fundamental. The idea of power, the idea of success, no longer felt as clear-cut as it once had. Was the future just about more wealth and more influence, or was there something deeper, something more meaningful, that he had yet to discover? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from one of his aides, a reminder of an upcoming meeting. He glanced at it briefly, but his mind wasn't fully on the task at hand. James' words kept echoing in his mind, replaying like a broken record. What was he supposed to do with this new knowledge? How could he, a man who had lived his life as a symbol of strength and authority, begin to change the way he saw the world? In the days that followed, Trump found himself thinking about James more and more. The boy had managed to do what no one else had been able to do: make him question everything. It wasn't just the words James had said, it was the way he had said them. There was an unmistakable wisdom in his voice, a kind of knowing that made Trump feel both awe and unease. How did a young person, a child really, understand these things so deeply? How had he learned to see the world with such clarity? Trump tried to shake off these thoughts as best as he could. He had responsibilities, after all. He couldn't afford to get lost in introspection. But every time he sat in a meeting or gave a speech, the weight of James' message lingered in the background, tugging at his consciousness. It wasn't just that James had exposed the flaws in his thinking. It was that the boy had given him a glimpse of something better, a way of living that didn't revolve around dominance, control, or material success. A way of living that revolved around understanding, empathy, and real change. One evening, weeks after their conversation, Trump found himself standing alone in his office, staring out at the skyline of New York City. The lights of the city stretched out before him, a sea of glass and steel that seemed to go on forever. He had spent years building his empire, a monument to his ambition and drive. But in that moment, looking out at the city he had once conquered, he realized how small it all seemed. All those years of striving for more, of pushing himself and others to achieve greatness, had led him here. But now, standing on the precipice of everything he had worked for, he couldn't help but feel like it wasn't enough. He took a deep breath and turned away from the window. He had a decision to make, a choice that would change the course of his life. The truth that James had shown him was undeniable. Power, in its truest form, wasn't about winning. It was about using your influence to help others, to make the world a better place. It was about building connections, not walls. Trump had always believed that success was something you earned by pushing yourself to the limit, by making sacrifices and taking risks. But what if the true measure of success wasn't in how much you had, but in how much you gave? That night, as he sat at his desk, Trump made a decision. He wouldn't change everything overnight. It would take time, effort, and a deep commitment to the ideals James had spoken about. But he would start by listening. He would begin by paying attention to the people who had always been in the background, the ones whose lives were shaped by the policies and decisions made by those in power. He would make an effort to understand their struggles, to hear their voices, and to use his platform to help amplify them. For the first time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Trump began reaching out to leaders in various communities, especially those that had long been marginalized. He met with activists, educators, and healthcare professionals. He visited schools in underprivileged areas, talking to students and teachers about the challenges they faced. He listened. He didn't try to solve everything in one go. Instead, he focused on understanding the problems, the complexities, and the nuances that shaped people's lives. He also started working on policies that would address the root causes of inequality. He pushed for education reform, increased healthcare funding, and initiatives to reduce poverty. It wasn't easy. There were many who doubted his sincerity, who questioned whether this was just another political maneuver. But Trump remained steadfast. He knew that this was different. This wasn't about making a name for himself or securing his legacy. It was about doing what was right. As he worked on these initiatives, Trump felt something change within himself. He began to see the world differently. The sense of power he had once chased so relentlessly began to lose its grip on him. He found fulfillment in helping others, in knowing that his actions could make a difference in people's lives. It wasn't the same kind of success he had known before, the kind that was measured in wealth and influence. But it was something deeper, something more meaningful. It was the kind of success that James had talked about, the kind that came from connection, from empathy, from understanding. Trump never forgot the conversation with James. It had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the spark that ignited a journey of self-discovery and transformation. And while there were still many challenges ahead, Trump knew that he had taken the first step toward a new kind of power, one that wasn't about control, but about change. It wasn't an easy path, but for the first time, Trump was ready to walk it. Trump's journey of transformation was not a smooth one, nor was it a simple one. It began with small steps, little changes in the way he interacted with others, the way he approached his leadership. But each of these steps felt monumental. It was as though he was learning to see the world with new eyes, eyes that had been clouded for far too long by ambition and a thirst for dominance. Every day, he struggled to balance the man he had been with the man he was becoming. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the old temptations to revert to his old ways of controlling and conquering seemed too strong to resist. But he kept pushing forward, relying on the lessons James had imparted to him, relying on that quiet wisdom that had shaken him to his core. He started by addressing his own actions first, trying to understand how his past decisions had affected those around him. He thought about the way he had often dismissed people's struggles, the way he had spoken over others, the way he had built walls rather than bridges. It hurt him to think about it, but he knew it was necessary. He had to confront the mistakes of his past in order to move forward. There were long nights when he lay awake, wrestling with his own guilt and regret. But there were also moments of clarity, where he could see a path ahead, a path that led not to more power or more wealth, but to something far more profound: the opportunity to do good, to right wrongs, to be a force for positive change in a world that so often seemed broken. One of the first major steps he took was in his approach to healthcare reform. He had always been vocal about his desire to overhaul the system, to make it more efficient, more affordable. But now, instead of just talking about it from a position of authority, he began to listen to those who were directly impacted by the system. He met with doctors, patients, and healthcare workers to hear their stories, to understand their frustrations, their fears, and their hopes for the future. He went into communities that had long been underserved, speaking to families who had struggled to access the care they needed. For the first time, he understood the real-life consequences of the policies he had championed in the past. He realized that the issue wasn't just about cutting costs or making the system more streamlined. It was about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background or their income, had access to the care they needed to live a healthy life. Trump began working tirelessly to reform the healthcare system, not just on a superficial level, but in a way that addressed the deep-rooted issues. He pushed for a healthcare system that prioritized preventative care, that ensured mental health was treated with the same seriousness as physical health, and that brought affordable options to rural communities. These were not easy battles. His proposals were met with fierce opposition from both sides of the political spectrum. Critics accused him of overstepping his boundaries, of trying to change a system that was already working for the wealthy. But Trump remained resolute. He knew that change was never easy, but it was necessary. He used his influence to push through legislation that would, in the long run, provide better access to health care for millions of Americans. But health care was just the beginning. Trump knew that if he was going to truly make a difference, he needed to do more than just reform policies. He needed to change the very culture of the country, to shift the way people viewed leadership, success, and power. He began advocating for education reform, pouring resources into schools in underserved areas, ensuring that children had the tools they needed to succeed in life. He spoke about the importance of mental health in education, the need to teach emotional intelligence alongside traditional subjects like math and science. He called for increased funding for programs that helped young people navigate the challenges of adolescence, from bullying to substance abuse to the pressures of social media. For many, Trump's new direction felt like a stark departure from the man they had known. The media, ever eager to pounce on anything that could stir controversy, questioned his sincerity. Was he really committed to this new vision, or was it just another political maneuver? They scrutinized his every word, looking for signs of the old Trump, the bombastic, ego-driven leader who had once ruled the country with an iron fist. But Trump didn't let the critics stop him. He knew that he was on the right path. He knew that real change didn't come from pleasing the masses. It came from doing what was right, even when it was unpopular. And so he continued. He met with more community leaders, more activists, more everyday people who had been ignored for too long. He listened to their stories, and he took action. He made sure that the policies he was advocating for were rooted in the real experiences of those who had been most affected by inequality. He worked to create a society where people were not judged by their status, their wealth, or their political connections, but by the content of their character and their ability to contribute to the greater good. Throughout this process, Trump's relationships with those closest to him also began to change. He reached out to family members, friends, and colleagues who had always been in his corner, but who had often been silenced by his domineering personality. He started having real conversations with them, conversations that weren't just about business or politics, but about life, about values, about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. These conversations were not always easy. There were moments of tension, of disagreement, of frustration. But they were also moments of growth, of understanding, of connection. One day, as Trump sat with his family in the living room of his private residence, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The room was filled with laughter, with light-hearted conversation, with warmth. For the first time in a long time, Trump felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He had been so focused on building an empire, on leaving a mark on the world, that he had forgotten what really mattered, the people he loved, the relationships he had neglected, the moments of connection that made life meaningful. As he watched his family interact, Trump couldn't help but think back to the conversation with James. It had been the catalyst for everything, the moment that had cracked open his carefully constructed world and forced him to see things differently. But it wasn't just James' words that had made the difference. It was the willingness to listen, to truly hear the stories of others, to open his heart to new ideas and perspectives. That was what had allowed him to begin changing. That was what had allowed him to start on the road to redemption. But even with all the progress he had made, Trump knew there was still so much work to be done. He had made mistakes, big ones, and the road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be challenges, and there would be moments when it felt like everything was falling apart. But he had a new understanding now. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, and that true power was not about dominating others. It was about lifting them up. It was about making the world a better place, not just for yourself, but for everyone. As the days passed, Trump continued to make strides, not just in his policies, but in the way he interacted with the world. He became a champion for those who had been left behind, a voice for the voiceless, a leader who used his power for good. He no longer sought validation in the accolades and applause of others. Instead, he sought meaning in the lives he touched, in the people he helped, in the changes he brought about. But even as he embarked on this new path, Trump knew that he would always carry the lessons he had learned from James with him. The boy's words had changed his life, had shifted the course of his destiny. And for that, Trump was eternally grateful. Trump stood at the window, looking out over the sprawling estate, the sky slowly shifting from orange to purple as the sun began to set. It was a rare moment of stillness in the whirlwind of his life, a life that had taken unexpected turns, where the once rigid boundaries he had created for himself were now fluid, reshaped by moments of introspection, self-doubt, and growth. He had walked away from the man he had once been, a figure defined by power and self-interest, and instead he was learning to become someone else, someone better, someone more attuned to the needs of others. He felt a calm in his heart, a quiet knowing that the path ahead, while still uncertain, would be one worth traveling. The lessons he had learned over the past few years weighed heavily on him, but they were no longer burdens. They were the building blocks of a new kind of leadership, one that didn't seek to conquer or control, but to heal and inspire. He thought back to that moment in the Oval Office when James had spoken his truth, when the child had dared to challenge him in a way no one else ever had. It was a pivotal moment, the moment that had cracked the shell of his old self and set him on a path he had never expected to take. In the days that followed, Trump had found himself questioning everything, from his values to his purpose, from the way he had treated others to the impact of his actions on the world. It wasn't an easy process, and it was far from linear. There were times when he wanted to return to the comfort of his old ways, when the temptation to revert to familiar strategies of control and dominance tugged at him. But each time he faced that temptation, he thought of James. He thought of the boy's quiet wisdom, of the way his words had cut through the noise of his life and reached him in a way nothing else had. James had spoken not from a place of anger or judgment, but from a place of pure honesty. And that honesty had cracked open something inside of him. It had given him permission to be vulnerable, to reflect, to change. Trump had worked tirelessly to follow through on the promises he had made to himself. He had pushed for healthcare reform that prioritized accessibility, putting the needs of the most vulnerable first. He had advocated for education initiatives that sought to uplift communities that had long been ignored. He had fought to reduce systemic inequalities that had plagued society for generations, even when it wasn't popular, even when it meant going against those who had once supported him. It wasn't a perfect system, he knew that, but it was a step in the right direction. The more he immersed himself in these projects, the more he realized that true power didn't lie in amassing wealth or in winning elections. True power lay in the ability to make a difference, to create lasting change that would ripple through generations. And yet, for all the external changes, it was the internal shift that had made the biggest impact. Trump's relationships with his family, his colleagues, and even his adversaries had transformed. No longer the hard-edged businessman with little regard for the opinions of others. He had learned to listen, to empathize, to connect. His family, too, had seen the difference. They had witnessed his evolution, the gradual peeling away of the layers of arrogance and self-interest that had defined him for so long. They saw him take accountability for past mistakes, something he had never done before. He began spending more time with his children, truly being present with them, asking them about their dreams, their fears, and their experiences. The love and support he had longed for in his own life were now present in his interactions with them. They had their own struggles, their own challenges, but Trump was there to guide them, to teach them the lessons he had learned through his own painful journey. It was a humbling experience, one that taught him the value of vulnerability. For all the walls he had built around himself throughout his life, walls that had kept others at a distance, walls that had protected him from pain, he realized that it was in letting those walls down that he found true connection. He was no longer just a leader. He was a father, a mentor, a friend. He was a human being, flawed and imperfect, but willing to learn and grow. As the days turned into months and the months into years, Trump's political career continued to evolve, though it was no longer the defining focus of his life. He still carried the weight of leadership, but now he wielded that leadership with a sense of responsibility, a deep understanding of the power he held. It was no longer about winning or losing, about gaining fame or fortune. It was about ensuring that his actions were aligned with his values, that they served the greater good. And when the inevitable criticisms came, when his past actions were brought up in the press or in debates, he didn't shy away. He confronted them head-on, acknowledging his mistakes without making excuses. He had learned that humility was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. He had learned that the greatest leaders were those who could admit when they were wrong and who were willing to make amends. One day, he was invited to a public event, a ceremony to honor those who had made significant contributions to the community. It was a simple gathering, not a grand spectacle, but there was something about it that called to him. As he stepped onto the stage, he looked out at the crowd and felt a sense of peace wash over him. The applause that greeted him was warm, but it wasn't the applause that mattered anymore. What mattered was the work, the lives he had touched, the changes he had made, and the person he had become. He had been asked to speak, and as he took the microphone, he hesitated for a moment. The old Trump, the one who thrived on spectacle and soundbites, would have given a rehearsed speech filled with bold promises and grandiose statements. But this time was different. He had no need for empty words. What he had to say was simple, and yet it carried more weight than anything he had ever spoken before. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice steady but sincere. "I've hurt people. I've been blinded by my own ambition. But I've learned that real power doesn't come from dominating others, from controlling outcomes. It comes from lifting people up, from working together, from understanding that we're all connected. I've learned that leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about listening. It's about being willing to change." He paused, letting the words settle in the air. The crowd was quiet now, hanging on every word. "I've been given a second chance," he continued, his gaze steady, "and I'm going to make sure I don't waste it. I don't have all the answers, but I know that we can do better. We can be better. And I'll keep working, keep learning, as long as I can." The room was silent for a moment before the applause began again, more subdued this time, more reflective. It wasn't the kind of applause that came with an announcement of a victory or a new policy. It was the kind of applause that came with recognition, with respect earned through actions rather than words. As Trump left the stage, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not the fleeting satisfaction of a campaign victory or the roar of a crowd, but the quiet contentment of knowing that, for once, he had said something that truly mattered. He had been true to himself, and he had been true to the lessons he had learned along the way. And in that moment, as he stepped back into the world that had once felt so foreign to him, he knew that his journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, still work to be done. But for the first time, he understood that the real work, the work that would last, was the work of the heart. As he walked away, he thought of James, and a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The boy had shown him a new way, had opened his eyes to a world he had never seen before. In the end, it was not the power of politics or the might of wealth that had transformed him. It was the power of one honest conversation, one moment of vulnerability, that had set him on a path of redemption. He was no longer the man he had been. He was something new, something better. And as he looked out at the horizon, he felt ready for whatever came next. He was no longer bound by his past. He was free to create a future that was truly his own.